we can't go make a bunch of unsustainable decisions in the hope that things get sustainable. But what we can do is just the fastest way to move is information. So the fastest way to change things is by simply just removing the walls that we've built and just opening things up and say, oh, you have this and you're 2 miles down the road.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Bailey. Bailey, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Tom, for having me on here. My name is Bailey Robin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Matium, and it's awesome to be here and to start talking about some of the reasons why data is so important in the supply chain.
Okay. And tell us a little bit, Bailey, about Matium. What is it? What do you do? Who do you serve? That kind of thing.
I'll back up a little bit to just how I got into the supply chain because I think that story is really what formed the idea. And it was one of those experiences where I kind of just looked at the life that I had led, whether it was on accident or not. I looked at some of the things that I had spent my time doing and realized that I was just in a position where I felt obligated to create Matium. So I'd gone to University of Michigan first for software engineering, and then eventually got my degree in industrial and operations engineering. And then from there, I moved around a lot as a kid. And as I left college, I ended up calling one of the more successful people that I had met during those travels and asked him for some advice on getting a sales job. And the next thing you knew, I was brokering plastics with a company called Bach Polymers down in Annapolis, Maryland. And so I didn't really know what that was all about or what that entailed. I just walked into an office where there was a good amount of money moving, and I immediately was infatuated with the idea of the supply chain. And my background is I was always very math and science focused. I really just like to think numbers, and so when I got into the supply chain, started to see what's going on. I was just shocked at the lack of market infrastructure, and I started to kind of notice that all of the value that I was giving to the industry, I was then pulling out of in margin and then never reinvesting it back into the industry. And so when I looked at kind of my life broadly as a 25-year-old kid who was moving about 120 million pounds of plastic a year,
Well,
I realized that I was either going to be showing up to work and playing my best game every single day of my life in order to do it either at that level or better, or I could just dedicate myself to building tools for the industry that would move us forward and create a better experience for the industry. And so I went that route. And so in 2021, I founded Matium to be the most efficient material medium. If you go back to my schooling as an industrial and operations engineer at Michigan, one of the classes that I took was lean manufacturing engineering. And what they talked about was process mapping. So you would
hmm,
start at the first piece of the process and then the final piece of the process. You would then standardize that entire process and basically notate how much time things take, what energy is involved, and so on, what the costs are. And then you look at that entire process and then start to identify value add and non-value add. And so value add is something that the customer is willing to pay for, and value add is basically overhead expense that the customer is not willing to pay for, but it might be required to do it. And so my teacher, Deborah, who's very skilled and experienced, she told stories about how, like at a Ford plant, they would take a turnover that would typically cost the plant $3 million in a week of uptime. They would take it. They would figure out how to get rid of all the non-value add work, and all of a sudden now it costs the plant $200,000 in a few hours. And so I,
right.
I was thinking about those principles and so on, and applying those principles to the material world. And that's just where we came up with the idea of there's all this material supply, whether it's waste, whether it's virgin material, whether it's intermediately processed material. There's all this material that has specifications, and it has a packaging and a price and an owner and a GPS location. All that material exists somewhere in the world. And then let's call that the first concept of supply. So there's the first concept of supply, and then you have the final concept of demand. The final concept of demand says that there's some consumer in the world that needs a product that has these characteristics such that it can hold this water for me so that the water doesn't fall out, that it doesn't br- become brittle in cold temperatures, that doesn't this. So all the demand in the world has some specification parameters. It has some pricing parameter, it has some GPS coordination parameter, it has some packaging parameter. That was the final concept of demand. And so what Matium is designed to do is to be the material medium between those two that most efficiently moves material. And our optimization function that we try to solve is how do we minimize cost, carbon, and time per unit of consumer demand. So really what Matium is just this entire interface and supply chain network that connects all companies together such that we can move materials through the supply chain efficiently so that the least amount of energy is expended per unit of consumer demand. And so through that, my goal is that we provide a better experience for industry. By providing a better experience for industry, then we are then capturing and standardizing data that is extremely valuable to then take that data to determine where capital should be invested within the supply chain such that it increases the efficiency of moving to that goal, which that goal I think for everybody should be how to minimize energy per unit of consumer demand. So that's a I'd say very technical way to describe Matium. At the end of the day, it's a supply chain network and material exchange. We help people buy and sell material. Our focus is to be the best experience for buying, selling, and shipping commodities in the world. Yeah, so we started with plastics, and I think plastics is really interesting. I mean, the idea started with I was looking at all of the biggest problems in the world, and you just consistently heard the plastics problem. And I consistently heard, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. Everybody has this opinion, everybody has this opinion. They all contradict each other. I had seen firsthand investments into the sustainability sector of plastics go wrong and turn belly up because the legislation that people were hoping for didn't happen. And
Mm.
so there's this plastics problem that just seemed like a total mess. And I was watching these different media outlets say certain things of this is what needs to happen. And just that's really what sparked the entire idea about getting the data. I mean, it was really, it sounds like nobody knows what the solution is. So we're just throwing out as many solutions as possible just trying to test them. My concern about that was that my children, my grandchildren are going to end up having to undo all the things that we do because they're not based in data, they're based in opinion. And so just as much as we want to solve the plastics problem, we can't solve the plastics problem by creating a carbon problem. We can't solve the plastics problem by creating an economic problem. And so that was where, again, just I felt lucky that I randomly walked into a plastics brokerage job. And then I had just back in college, I chose to study industrial and operations engineering because it was a little bit easier than computer science. Like, there were a few things that just luckily happened in my life that kind of set me up to focus on plastics. So we focus on plastics, but then we'll open up into papers and fibers in Q1. Atom is a material agnostic platform. So the vision is to really be the medium for all materials to move through. But plastics gives us that nice first market to deal with because plastics kind of has already its own verticals and its own horizontals. So plastics already is broken up between polypropylene, polyethylene, PET, and PEC, and ABS and so on, and it's already broken up into scrap and regrind and resin and so it's its own really dynamic market that we're able to, and it also has probably the largest technical complication of the markets because I mean polypropylene what matters is melt and izod and flex and tensile, but then on PET what matters is IV and L value and A value and B value, and so all of them have such these like complicated, the way that we say is like plastics is its own Chinese language that not many people know, so we try to figure out how to kind of standardize that for everybody. So plastics was kind of just a lucky first start, but the vision is to really use everything.
Okay. And what would you say has surprised you most in your journey from plastics brokerage to now founder of Matium?
Oh, I will say, I don't know if this surprised me. I just think that my optimistic nature caused me to have more pain than I probably should have had. But I founded a freight company as well called Tomorrow Made, and I just freight's a tough business. It's hard. So I founded that for the purpose of providing some optionality in terms of how we can deliver a good customer experience. Because the entire thing that I want to do is I was sitting on my couch and I was ordering stuff on Amazon. And the next thing you know, I'm getting up from the couch to go work on my actual job. And shipping things from point A to point B on Amazon was a click of a button, and I trusted it, and it showed up in 2 days, and it was great. And then I walked over and sat at my office, and I'm spending 30 minutes to make a PO and then send that over and then talk to a bunch of different freight brokers and then they all give me different answers and then when there's a problem, then I got to call that guy who calls the dispatcher, who calls the carrier, who then calls that, and by the time that I get the answer, then it's already done. So I was thinking through that, and I'm like, technology is just by default a democratized thing. And so, why haven't we built infrastructure for everybody to use so that the people who actually deliver the good, like who actually make and deliver the goods for consumers, why is it so much harder for them to do their jobs when it's so much easier for consumers to just consume it?
Yeah.
So, really, the thought was, all right, I'll build this freight company. I'll make it. It'll be the easy. It'll be an easy. It'll be an easy add-on. I'll spend 10% of my effort on doing that, and then it'll fit in really nicely. I mean, so it ended up working, but I would say hats off to anybody who runs a freight brokerage or to anybody who runs a freight company. That is a much harder thing than I had expected. Again, luckily I pushed through it, made some late calls that got it up and running, and got it to do what we needed to do. I think that what's really interesting to me on having that optionality moving forward at Matium is that there's a good chance that trucking is automated within the next decade. I think there's a certainty that it's automated within the next 2 decades. So to have the ability, both from a regulatory purpose and from a credit purpose, to be able to extend that service into assets like that is a really interesting possibility for the customers that are on Matium.
And you talked a little bit about sustainability, and this is the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast. What do you personally define as sustainability? You know, is it a goal? Is it a process? Is it a combination of the two, or is it something else entirely? You know, talk to me about that.
Yeah, so I thought about that question a lot when I was first creating Matium because I was making more money than I knew what to do with trading plastics. I felt crazy to think that I was going to leave it all, and I thought I need to do something with my life that is going to give me purpose and that's going to do something like that's going to leave the world a better place. And so when I was thinking about the definition of sustainability, because again, that was the thing that the plastics problem and just sustainability as a very loosely, I was seeing it used differently by everybody. I thought about that and I was trying to figure out, okay, I need to build something that I'm willing to work on for the next 40 years of my life. And so if I'm going to do that, of course I want it to be sustainable, but like let's figure out what that means and let's put that in writing so that we can actually just like start doing something about it. The first mission statement that I wrote down for Matium was to help humanity create a sustainable future. And
Mhm.
so that was the whole focus. And what that meant to me was that my children and their children can live a better life than I do today. And so that was the very simple way that I looked at it was just how do we make decisions today and how do we set up systems and infrastructure today that creates a better world for everybody once we're gone. And so
Mhm.
that's the holistic view of sustainability that I have. Now we've gotten granular. So I mean, our mission statement now says to help humanity create a sustainable future by minimizing carbon and time per unit of consumer demand, because I believe that that is the math behind that goal. And I think it pulls all the emotions out. And I can even say, I mean, calling something a plastics problem, for instance, is short-sighted because plastics may be the substrate that is the most sustainable, but like until we all agree that there is a mathematical formula that we can say is it sustainable or not, it's a really hard thing to say. I mean, I can say that there's a huge paper problem, or I can say that there's a huge coconut problem, but it's hard for anyone to argue that with me without just having all of the data. So I think that when I looked at sustainability, I mean, one, that's how I defined it, but two, I wanted to build something that would provide the circuitry or catalyst or entry point, or maybe even off ramp, provide optionality to industry such that if I need materials to perform in this way and they're currently plastic, well, let's make a material agnostic platform that doesn't look at what the thing is called, but let's look at where it comes from, let's look at how much it costs, and let's look at how it performs. And therefore, all of a sudden now, like, there's no world where we say plastics is gone by 2030 and then that all happens. Like what really has to happen is that we start to say, all right, well, this really cool group out of Nebraska just made this really cool cornstarch polymer that is super cost effective and they can make a ton of it, and then all of a sudden that starts to take this market, and that starts to take this market, and then the folks that are making the seaweed plastic down in the Dominican say, oh, like that, all of a sudden this is replacing all the biopolymer that goes into all the mulch film for farmers. And so this doesn't happen all at once. This is not a Boolean yes or no. This is a over time you start to have economic advantages, you start to have carbon advantages, and so on. But like there always it has to be a motivation from the person making the decision, the person who's buying the material to stick it into a machine. There has to be a motivation at that person's level to say, I'm going to choose this versus this. And I've participated in a good amount of the industry conversations, and I think that we often think that it's all up to the brands or that it's all up to the recyclers, or that's all that everybody likes to say, no, you got to solve our problem, or legislators, you got to solve our problem, or
Mhm.
recyclers, you're not making enough, you got to solve our problem. Well, like it's nobody's fault. None of us were born in the 1800s. Like we didn't create this problem, we're part of it now. And so how do we just take a step back and say, okay, this isn't going to happen tomorrow. This isn't going to happen in 5 years, and this is not going to happen in 10 years. But how can we start to chip away at this? And so I think that's where I want to head, is that we just help as many people as possible make better decisions for their wallet, for the world, and for their business themselves.
And I mean, a lot of companies are currently doing things like setting ambitious carbon reduction targets. Where do you think they should start if they're looking at their supply chains and that?
Yeah. So the fastest way to decarbonize the supply chain is to stop shipping material from British Columbia to Virginia when that same material exists in North Carolina. So that's the biggest piece. I've had some conversations with some sustainability investors, and they always come back and say, "Well, how's this helping sustainability?" Like, well, I mean, unless you want to go spend hundreds of millions of dollars on new infrastructure to put to and then guess where it should go, and move all of that concrete and spend all of those people's hours of their lives and spend all of that money, we can't go make a bunch of unsustainable decisions in the hope that things get sustainable. But what we can do is just the fastest way to move is information. So the fastest way to change things is by simply just removing the walls that we've built and just
Mm.
just opening things up and say, oh, you have this and you're 2 miles down the road. When I used to broker, we used to think, oh my God, this plant is 500 feet from the other plant. I'm going to buy this material at 20 cents a pound and sell it at 30 cents a pound. Do you think that they're gonna do you think that they're gonna meet up at lunch and realize that they just lost all that money? Like, and it's just the information gap in the industry is what's such it's the reason why we sit here and talk about all of these problems as if we don't know how to solve them, because nobody knows what's going on. So I think that, again, when you look at decarbonization, there's a lot of great work going on with decarbonized materials. I mean, those are 100% going to have markets forever. I think the fastest way that we solve that problem is by becoming a little bit more efficient in terms of market infrastructure, market information, decreasing the length of supply chains. I mean, carbon is a derivative of energy expenditure. So, I mean,
Right.
every single time that you burn gas, or anytime that you're generating energy, unless it's completely carbon neutral, that is causing you to emit carbon. So, if we just, and I'm going to get super physics minded, like if we just look at just the equation of work, which is work equals force times distance, and so that you just have mass times acceleration times distance. If you so There are two ways that we solve this problem. You either minimize mass or you minimize distance. And so if we want to minimize mass, that means, okay, let's find the substrates that are the lightest, that solve our problem of containing things in the world that we need to be contained. I mean, that's why carbon fiber became such a huge thing once it was created, because it's lightweight. It gives lower weight that people want without sacrificing the performance that they need.
Yeah.
And so, how do we do that with as many products in the world as possible? And then distance, that's really where, again, information comes in. How do we get connected and how do we expand the accessibility and the liquidity of these markets? So all of a sudden, I'm not restricted to buying my PTG from China or back and forth. Like the most unsustainable thing that we can do is be buying material and buying products. Well, let's just go from an American standpoint. The most unsustainable thing that we can do is buy all of our products from China, because when I was a kid, we used to talk about digging down and hitting China. So we're buying 80+% of our products from a country that's across the world, and then thinking that that we should address all the brands. I think that we should probably address the systematic problem, which is that we can't produce products effectively domestically. So, like, if we can produce things effectively domestically, all of a sudden you remove 85% of that problem of carbon. So yeah, I mean, it's minimizing mass and distance within the equation of from supply to consumer.
Okay, very good. And in terms of energy, then, energy costs are obviously on people's mind at the moment. Lots of things impacting those. Where do you see their impact on supply chains in the coming years, and how do you think AI might factor into making supply chains more resilient?
Yeah, so I think you're going to end up having a graph that looks like this, and then back down. I mean, we've got a few friends in the nuclear world. I think nuclear has a good chance of being the next big energy wave. I think that that's also there's a weird kind of underlying connection of and why I believe anybody who wants the plastics problem to be solved needs to back nuclear. Because the issue is that if you want to back petrochemicals, you are then going to decrease the marginal carbon footprint of plastics. So if you want to back petrochemicals, well, petrochemicals are creating that byproduct, which is polymer grade, taking that monomer and turning it into polymer. So you're decreasing the cost of plastics by generating more petrochemicals. If we have an energy shortage, you need to think of other ways to make energy if you want to also get rid of plastics. And so I think that's just an interesting kind of note, is that we just as much as we want to solve the plastics problem, we have to figure out how to get off of petrochemicals for that to even be a possibility. I mean, with the data centers that are being put up right now, AI is going to generate more electricity demand than we've ever seen. Again, I think that that's going to be a short-term problem. Energy, like the nice thing about AI is that it solves the majority of our engineering and technological problems at a speed that we've never even had before. So I believe that what we've seen in terms of technological advancement since I was born, which is in the mid '90s, what just the speed that we've seen that happen, where electric cars weren't a thing, cell phones weren't a thing. I mean, everything that is now just ubiquitous. That the speed that happened is going to be one fourth, roughly, of what the speed is going to be for AI, just due to the fact that it's exponential. And so, although we will see a huge spike due to all the data center demand, we will see new forms of energy. I mean, I think we'll see fusion's been talked about for a long time. I think that we're
Mhm.
on the cusp of solving that. And so, what I'm building Matium for is actually the future in which energy costs are nearing zero. I believe that by the time we're 20 years in, I think that that's more accurate than energy costs being higher than they are today. I think it's closer to zero than it is closer to where they are today. And so, what that really paints as a future is that, again, everything all of a sudden becomes just minimizing the distance of supply chains and then maximizing the ability to access that information between supply and demand. The vision that I have for how this all looks, again, 20, 30 years from now, is you've got micro factories throughout the entire country. You've got micro factories throughout the world that are powered with very low cost energy, and you've got more advanced manufacturing systems that are more agile in terms of how they produce products. And so I would see more of a like just in time model across the board for, again, more micro factory style production, because if you have If you can automate the entire process and then you can get the energy costs down, now all of a sudden you can create small batches. You can do a lot of the things that you're restricted from doing today because of labor costs and because of energy costs. I mean, the biggest concern right now with running maybe a short run, if you're a compounder or you're a manufacturer, is that once you run a short run, you have that entire turnover problem. So every single time that you have downtime, that's cost to your books, and you can't afford that. And so as we get into automation, that's really where we end up having localized supply chains. We have localized societies. We get back to a world that I think is a lot better. I think the biggest risk that I see with that new feature is that if one, and this is a huge piece of how Matium was designed, was that I fear the world where there's one company that owns the majority of those assets, because wealth does compound in this instance. Once you have one, that one makes four, and so on and so on and so on, and then it becomes a race that you can never win. I grew up as a poor kid out of Flint, Michigan. I didn't know what wealth was like. Knew it for about a year until I dumped it all back into Madium. Now I look at what the world is going to be like in the future, and we need to again democratize. This is what we have in a lot of our marketing materials. We need to democratize the access to enterprise grade infrastructure such that everyone has a level playing field in this new world, and that it does become more of a relationship game in localized supply chains rather than just this company is so big and has so many assets across the entire country that just their costs are so low that they just crush everybody. I think that there's a way where we get a mix of both worlds where everybody has access to that. There's more access to financing. All of these supply chains start to turn over a little bit faster, and the folks that are really ambitious and really motivated within these supply chains are the ones that are planting up a spot here and a spot here and a spot there. And so that's what I hope we can get to as a world. I think that none of us have ever seen what's going on before. I think there's a lot of unknowns in the world today. So yeah, we'll see what happens. But that's my thought.
Yeah, and if you could fast forward 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, what would you hope to see as kind of the standard for sustainability in supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this is what we're trying to do. I think that there needs to be an immutable transaction ledger that not only has verified transaction information around materials, but also verified transaction information around the carbon that was generated. The issues that you're having right now is that scope three is nearly impossible to track because there's no network transaction layer anywhere.
Mm.
That's the thing that we are trying to solve, just kind of as a stage three of our business. People talk about blockchain. I mean, we can be somewhat technology agnostic. Blockchain is another way to do it. What really needs to happen is that everybody needs to have, again, just some sort of source of truth that everyone agrees on. That
Mm.
this is what happened. Buyer approved, seller approved. This was the financial transaction, and that financial transaction then owns a material movement, location to location, and then also then like the carbon that was generated from that. I think that once we have those two things, it becomes really easy to just tie that to financing. So I don't think that you really need to do a whole lot. You just need to, like, carbon markets aren't going to move until that happens. Carbon markets have been kind of sitting around being a thing that maybe will happen, maybe won't happen, but there's just not been enough adoption from the big players. And so once you have a transaction ledger where there's a comparative nature and there's some secondaries where you can start to kind of trade on it, that's where things get really interesting. That's where we don't have to create a new wheel. Like, the capital system is already very efficient. Like, it does work. You can look at the markets. I mean, we have systems in place to incentivize really big problems, and so we just need to get to the point where there is a market. I think that, yeah, that's my big bet, is that if you make a market and you provide a transaction ledger, then at that point the markets will handle themselves. And so we're completely focused on just building the power lines and building the system and trying to support the industry as fast as possible. Because I do think that I don't think we have enough urgency as a society to get it done.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, with that in mind, a left field question. If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a spokesperson for sustainability and supply chains, who would it be and why?
This is a this is this is the answer that we've actually talked about in our office, but more from a standpoint of being funny. But I would love to have Matthew McConaughey do a all right, around around the material markets. So yeah, I got a good buddy who's living down in Austin. I think he's uh, connected with him a couple times, but he more for the standpoint of just the good vibes. It'd be nice to have him around. So I would if he's around, then we'll take him when he's not busy. But
Fair enough. Fair enough. And talk to me as well about work-life balance. I mean, running a startup like Matium must be intense. How do you stay grounded, and what kind of hobbies keep you energized?
yeah, I've always enjoyed traveling. I've always enjoyed playing music. I play a good amount of guitar. I think that spending your time doing something that's creative is extremely important. I think that the biggest thing for anybody who knows me on LinkedIn, like I've got a picture of me and a llama on Rainbow Mountain in Peru as my profile picture. So I try to do that on purpose, just because again, this is the this is a very big math problem to me, and trying to figure out how to solve it in a way that supports people is, I would say, a thing of things, right? And so in a world of things, I definitely long for the ability to be creative and just kind of live more in outward rather than just kind of like processing, right? And so just like letting go a little bit and doing that from whether it's I've got my two best friends are very big into content creation, and we've made movies and doing acting and stuff like that. I mean, that's always fun, and then just playing songs and yeah, just trying to find some time to be creative. Or the other route is just going and sitting in the woods and remembering that we all used to just sit around fires and relax and fishing and hunting and some of the stuff that again just pulls me out of this rat race that I think can sometimes feel a little overwhelming.
Sure.
There's something to do about working on the system, and that system being such a big thing that I think runs a lot of our lives, that it's always super valuable just to get out of it every now and then.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair. Fair. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Bailey. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I would just say I think that the one area we didn't cover, and I mentioned it briefly, I think that the economic issues that we have today are so large, and it's all connected. I think that there's often this separation between sustainability and economics and marketing and all like it we kind of silo it, and it's probably because people have their own specializations and they have their own interests and they have their own lives, and you're a marketing person, so you see it from a marketing light, and you're an economics major and you see it from an economic light. So I would just say that with problems as big as this, where it touches everything that we look at, when you look around your life, and I mean, it's this table that I'm sitting on, it's part of the computer, I mean, it's in my clothes. When we think about these big problems, it gets so complicated, and we think so much about everything that we forget
Mm.
that we can break it down into just really simple things. And I always look at it from an intention perspective, and this is where I get back to economics, is that everybody at the end of the day really needs to put food on their table, and they really
Mm.
need to take care of their family. Like when I was mentioning the camping, like when you leave the woods after just sitting around a fire and not having your phone and not having anything besides the fish that you're catching on the river and a couple snacks, you remember that we just need friends, family, and food,
Mm.
and shelter unless you're in a nice place. Yeah, yeah. And so we need to figure out how to meet people's basic needs at a reasonable level so that they can have a quality life. And I think that from the perspective of the US, like we are the consumption pit for the world. We have been trained to buy things and to eat things and to do things as much as possible so that there's as much monetary movement as possible. And I think that that is hurting ourselves, it's hurting the world, it's hurting the chance that we have at a sustainable future. And so I would just say that when we look at the economic problems that we have today, we can get rid of a lot of the noise and just think about what matters first. And if there's kind of ancillary or if there's discretionary kind of things in the world that we can think about, great. Like let's figure that out once we figure out, okay, how can we sustainably meet the needs of as many people as possible, first in our country and then in our continent and then in the world. But how can we make that an economically sustainable process? Because until we do that, there's no world where we ever get to stage two, stage three, stage four, stage five. And so I would just say that when we look at, again, the economics of, for instance, the US, or when we look at the economics of many countries that are typically importing a lot of their goods, when energy costs go to zero, the most efficient, economic, and sustainable way to meet the physical needs of people is to produce products as close to the demand as possible with as much circular material as possible. As long as that circular material came from a location that was close to that demand. And so I would just say that we need to go back to first principles. We need to simplify the problem. We need to agree on step one before we ever think about step five, step six, step seven. Because I think that would just we're looking at big problems, and I think we all have megaphones, and I think the noise is drowning out the things that we probably said on day one that we got away from.
Bailey, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed on the podcast here today, where would you have me direct them?
For anybody who would like to check out Matium, our website is matium.com. For anybody who'd like to see more about what I'm doing, my LinkedIn is Bailey Robin. I believe it's LinkedIn /Bailey Robin 1. And then if you'd like to take a look at what Tomorrow Made is tomorrowmade.io. If you want to follow Matium on LinkedIn, that would just be Matium, and it should pop up right there. Just a note for anybody who is in the supply chain and interested in Matium, we are only accepting right now companies who are in North America. For any company who does want to market their materials into the North American continent on Matium, you can talk with us, and we will pair you up with a verified distributor who will take that ownership of managing the cross border transactions and marketing, and also that relationship. All accounts are free. If you'd like to learn more about the premium subscriptions, that's where it gets into some costs. But our goal is just to connect as many people as possible that move, make, and trade commodities.
Fantastic. Great. That's been fascinating, Bailey. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom.